Hi everyone, I'm Gary Null. I'd like to welcome you to our program where we talk about health and nutrition issues. Well, what's the #1 health topic in the world? AIDS. And who's going to get it? We've been believing everyone is equally susceptible. It's an infectious disease. We're spending more money on AIDS this year than on cancer and heart disease combined. Over $5 billion. There are over 70,000 organizations raising money for AIDS. Well, what do we have to show for this? Do we have cures? Do we have vaccines? Do we even have an understanding of this disease? You're going to hear from dissidents, leading scientists, Nobel Prize winners, journalists, activists, clinicians, who are in the front of the battle on AIDS who say, we've had it all wrong. We've been lied to, manipulated by self-serving interest groups who've been feeding at the public trough. They fed at the trough on cancer. Same groups, same organizations are feeding at the trough on AIDS. Let's see if they're right. Let's go out into the field, around the world, and take on AIDS a second opinion.
The more fear we have regarding our external environment, the more our adrenal glands start to secrete adrenal hormones. These very same adrenal hormones are very important in reducing the immune response. So the more we have fear of the external environment, the more greatly reduced our immune system is in handling its own internal consequences. So for example, a person with AIDS might have an immune defect or immune problem in which the person is trying to cope with. But at the same time, if they're dealing with an external stress about their own life, their own existence, that external stress will weaken their immune system and allow the AIDS virus or whatever the AIDS syndrome is associated with to take more charge, more power over the individual.
There's a ritual amongst the Australian Aboriginals, which is called bone pointing. It's a very effective form of capital punishment in their society. When someone has broken a taboo, which is unacceptable, a ritual is held and a bone is pointed at them and they're told that they will die. And inevitably, in the course of 6 to 8 weeks, they do. The antibody test is exactly as effective as that. I see people again and again whose will to live and confidence to live is destroyed.
People who are told they're HIV positive have every reason to believe it. And this belief could be deadly. And we see many, many people who are otherwise healthy who suddenly stop sleeping and eating. Their whole life is turned upside down. They don't have the energy for the future. And every little health problem they have is greatly magnified as they believe this is living proof that they're dying.
There were new groups, not the original risk groups, who were also getting diseases that you could call AIDS, with the symptoms of AIDS. For example, in 1984, very early days in AIDS, our attention was drawn here in London to a disease in Uganda called Slim disease. It was called Slim disease by local people because the chief feature to them was that they lost weight and then died. In fact, it was AIDS. As it spread across Uganda into Tanzania, we could see from analysing blood samples that HIV was spreading in exactly the same pattern. So there was a new risk group.
I feel that we have grossly overstated the seriousness of AIDS in Africa. In fact, I even wonder whether there is any kind of epidemic of AIDS in that continent. I've reached this view after looking at the issue for over a period of years now, but including within that a personal visit when the newspaper sent me to several Central African countries to talk to health ministers, virologists, hospital doctors, patients, and charitable organisers to find out what was going on. One of the first things these charitable workers did when they set up their operation back in the late 1980s in Kagera province was talk to local people and say, let's do something about this emergency that you're facing. And they found widespread pessimism and dispiritedness of a people who said, what's the point? You know, we've been told that up to half of our people test HIV positive. We're all going to die. We've no future. So one of the first things that they did after learning of that state of mind was set up their own HIV testing laboratory and institute surveys to see if the picture was really as bad as they'd been led to believe. And they found it was nothing like that, with careful repeat testing, so that your first wave of false positives were checked, and then maybe sometimes a third test. They found that the figure was nothing like 50%. In fact, in some of their surveys, it was as low as 5%. And they found that when they treated the illnesses that these people suffered from, they recovered the same as anybody else. So they'd ended up concluding that there was no AIDS in that region.
What I discovered in Africa was that the infrastructure, social and medical, is non-existent. Post-colonially, over all these 20 to 30 years now, 40, the services have disappeared. Malaria control, TB control. In areas like the Rakai in Uganda, there is no water that's clean. The pathogenic assault, the toxic assault of filthy water, malaria 11 times before you're 7 years old, diarrhea 7 times before you're 1 year old, makes your immune system very, very at risk and depressed. And if you test people with a severely challenged immune system, it is likely, according to the work of Professor Hessig and Eleni Eliopoulos now in Perth, that you will show antibodies that come up from the stress. And these antibodies are being called specific to HIV and are being called infected by HIV. I don't believe that. I believe they are auto-antibodies that are developed as a result of your body's immune stress position.
A virus as a parasite will do more damage in a body that is already weak than in one that is strong.
Many of the world's illnesses are caused by lack of drinking water and lack of sanitation, which is a direct consequence of poverty and lack of resources. And yet, a lot of the money is being poured into the AIDS industry rather than being put into the basic health care that people need to survive.
What we have is a situation where Uganda and many other Central African sub-Saharan countries are being considered as huge AIDS risk countries, and they're receiving quite a lot of money from international organizations like USAID, the Centers for Disease Control, the WHO, our Medical Research Council for AIDS. That money goes into testing or condom distribution or sex education. So what you see is huge Toyotas driving around country lanes in Uganda, full of condoms in the back, full of smart, bright, young American AIDS sex counselors, telling people that it's their fault they got AIDS or sick because they made love to somebody new, making them feel enormously guilty. And the money that should have been going to giving them medication, because, you know, I saw their dispensaries are empty, their cottage hospitals are empty, there are no medicines. The money that should have been going for TB cures, for malaria cures, for clean water, has all been stopped. It's all for AIDS. $6 million went into Uganda in 92-3 for AIDS. $250,000 went for malaria control. How on earth can you justify that?
I think that probably a good third or half of the African AIDS cases have tuberculosis as their AIDS indicator disease. And since you have two things going on with tuberculosis, number one, it cross-reacts on the HIV antibody tests, and number two, it can cause T-cell depletion all by itself, then you've got a big problem in Africa. Do these people have AIDS or do they have tuberculosis? Of course, in Africa, they don't do T-cell counts and they don't do HIV antibody tests for the most part anyhow, because they don't have the money. And so you don't even know who would be positive in Africa. It's all just a big guessing game.
People who tested positive were at more risk in that the test picked up immune system activation from this great variety of causes, whether it was malaria, whether it was TB, whether it was the leprosy agent, whether it was activity of these microbes and many others in Africa because of chronic malnutrition. In those circumstances, people were testing positive in millions who had nothing to do with any new disease agent. And that was the great tragedy of this test.
The healthcare budgets in many African countries are just so low, so minimal, that they don't perform these tests at all. They do it on the basis of a clinical case definition. And that definition includes such things as weight loss of greater than 10% of your body weight, chronic diarrhea, a persistent fever and cough, things like that, which are very nonspecific symptoms. In fact, those symptoms could be the symptoms of tuberculosis or any other number of things. But in Africa, they can give you an AIDS diagnosis based on that constellation of symptoms.
I recently went to Haiti because I'm writing a book about AIDS, about our 9-year experience. It's called Only Make Believe. And I went to Haiti to research a chapter called Whatever Happened to AIDS in Haiti. I went to one of the hospices there. It was actually St. Teresa's Hospice in the middle of Port-au-Prince in Haiti, where they told me there were lots of AIDS cases. I was shown round by a very, very nice Mother Superior, the nun, and she was obviously doing her best, but didn't know, in a sense, how awful it was, what was going on. She told me that 100% of the people in these wards had TB. But because the charity had enough money to test them for HIV, they sent everyone's blood for testing. 90% of the women in the ward I was in, she said, were HIV positive. Because they had AIDS and were going to die anyway, they were not receiving medication for TB. Well, as you know, if you have TB, you're very likely to test positive because there's a cross-reaction. And they weren't being treated because they were going to die anyway. And this is something I saw in Africa as well. The death sentence means, let's not bother, you know?
Haemophiliacs have a single gene defect in one of two clotting factors, and the more severely affected need treatment. The symptoms they get, bleeding, is well described, well defined, and is different from AIDS. Now, if you're saying, well, no evidence from haemophiliacs is valid because they are not as healthy as, say, you or me, well, too bad. I just disagree with you.
The idea that hemophiliacs are healthy people is utterly absurd. Hemophilia itself is immune suppressive. When you compound that by multiple blood transfusions, each blood transfusion is known to suppress the immune system. The body is having to cope with innumerable factors from another person's blood, and this itself causes immune suppression.
Haemophiliacs have always had the haemophiliac condition which has rendered them ill. The clotting factor that they'd been given since the late 60s was alleged to have infected most of them, if not all of them, with hepatitis viruses, or hepatitis agents as they were called.
The hemophiliacs, which were since '69 were given prophylactically factor VIII preparation, which was forbidden before because they were afraid of antibody production against the factor preparations because they're very impure. Only 0.3% is pure activity. The rest is cellular debris, proteins, foreign proteins. There are all the liver diseases coming from in the case of hemophiliacs. And of course, this results in positivity. They have huge amounts of foreign proteins introduced to their body. The body makes antibodies against, and then they come up with a positive HIV test.
In America, you have 11,500 people who are supposed to have been infected with HIV via contaminated factor VIII. The only evidence that we have that any haemophiliacs are infected with HIV is antibodies. HIV has never, ever been isolated in factor VIII. I've offered a £5,000 reward for that. Duisburg cannot give me a reference. Baltimore cannot give me a reference. Gallo cannot give me a reference. Montagnier can't give me a reference. John Maddox at Nature. Nobody can give me a reference. The simple fact is HIV was not and could not have been in factor VIII.
Virtually all the factor VIII that was alleged to have infected the haemophiliacs was commercially made from paid donors' plasma. In other words, people walked into bucket shops and sold their plasma for so much a donation because they needed the money. That meant everybody from Bowery bums to winos to drug addicts, very sick, very poor people who couldn't manage on welfare stamps. They needed the money.
When they were switched to a purified form of factor VIII treatment, one that didn't contain proteins from thousands and millions in some instances with these preparations of other people, that their immune systems, on the basis of the very basic T-cell counting, which has always been a hallmark of decline towards AIDS, their immune systems become stronger. The T-cell counts do a U-turn in many instances.
A study on haemophilia in Edinburgh, which had shown that only the HIV positives got AIDS and the HIV negative haemophiliacs didn't. Actually, that interpretation, as Duisberg pointed out to me, was not accurate. Half of the HIV positives got AIDS, and half of the HIV positive haemophiliacs didn't, but nobody ever said that. And the only ones that got AIDS had a genetically inherited blood disorder, a very severe one. It's called HLA haplotype or something like that.
Is there a link between the drugs given to treat AIDS and the AIDS condition itself?
The so-called late-term effects of AIDS are actually, to the effects of the antiretrovirals and other drugs that could be in the environment. Late effects of fungal infections, even without antifungals, will be identical. The levels of T cells are affected in similar ways by high infections of Candida. Certain anti-inflammatories can give you similar effects. A hodgepodge of medical products can give you similar effects. Saying that only, quote, HIV-related AIDS will cause these effects is being completely ignorant of pharmacology.
Sulfa drugs known as Septrim, Bactrim, Cotrimoxole and TMP-SMX have been used since the 70s extensively against infections. This therapy, used in all HIV positive tested people today, damages the bone marrow where the cells of the immune system are formed. They damage the thymus gland where these cells are elevated. They damage the intestinal mucosa that we need to uptake nutrition. And it damages the mitochondria that we need as an antioxidative and respiratory system.
I initially was diagnosed in '89 and tested at a 900 level T4 count and was prescribed at that time AZT, which I took for a month and a half. And of course subsequently became very, very ill from it. And I decided in the meantime that as I was taking AZT to find out more about the drug, and as I learned it was extremely toxic, and I decided then to stop taking it and immediately got better. So at that point I had already had an early experience with the medical system and HIV treatment that had scared me and made me realize that they probably didn't know as much as they told me they knew about treatment.
AZT actually, according to the Merck manual and according to the manufacturer, is in and of itself a profoundly toxic, potent immunosuppressive drug.
I don't know how many of the people who have died, so-called of AIDS, have actually died of AZT, because it certainly would wreck your immune system to take that stuff for a few years. It's like if you started taking any other chemotherapeutic agent for the rest of your life, it would be that agent probably that killed you. You know, when you give chemotherapy to somebody with cancer, you give them a round of it for maybe 14 days or a few days. Hopefully you're not going to kill the patient, you're going to kill the cancer. The patient's going to survive. But you don't keep giving it to him until he dies, because he certainly will. And AZT is just like those things. It's a little more lethal, than most of the anti-cancer things that people take for that.
AZT not only terminates DNA synthesis of all sorts, but it also acts in other ways. It acts in the mitochondria to lead to the oxidation of the mitochondrial DNA in ways which were not suspected. I'm thinking of the work of Miyazawa and Ozawa. It destroys mitochondrial function, and the mitochondria may be the secret to the degenerative diseases. AZT causes instant old age. AZT causes you to age more rapidly.
The Glaxo Wellcome Company needed a new market. So they've latched on to pregnant women, people who've been told that they weren't at any particular risk for AIDS until now, people who are a brand new market, who are very naive about this stuff, who don't know what this horrible drug does, and they're being coerced, practically bludgeoned by the medical establishment to have themselves tested for HIV, and if they test positive, they're going to have this full court press from the medical establishment to get them to take AZT, and they'll say, well, it's for the good of your baby. You don't want your baby to be born with the deadly AIDS virus, do you? What they're not saying, of course, is that in the studies that they cited to justify this nonsense, only 25% of the babies born to HIV-positive mothers tested positive themselves in the control group. So we're talking about 3/4 of the babies who will never have this, even if HIV does anything, which I don't believe it does. And besides, the babies who were born to mothers who took AZT were 3 times as likely to have birth defects as the babies in the control group. So this is really an incredibly dangerous push.
The PENTA trial is a trial of where AZT is being given to very young children, most of whom are black. 71% in Britain of the children involved in the PENTA trial are black. And the trial is designed to establish whether AZT should be given early on or later in the child's lifetime. And these children are HIV positive. They don't have symptoms of AIDS, so they're perfectly healthy children. And many of the children involved in the PENTA trial have suffered very serious side effects.
They're making a lot of money off the marketing of AZT, and what we've seen with other drugs is that when they're proved to be toxic in industrialized countries, they then take that same drug to the third world, and it's then dumped onto third world people whose health is already undermined by poverty, overwork, and lack of resources.
These drug companies shouldn't be saying, okay, we got the drug now that we make a bundle off of this drug. We don't need to do further investigation into how to make it better for the people with AIDS that need the drug. All we need to do is take the money and stick it in our pocket, and then we'll, throw a couple of, tens of thousands of dollars around for some educationals about our drugs that we want people to buy, and that'll make us good community contributors. We need to demonstrate to the world that this is where it begins. This is Wall Street. This is the stock market. This is the embodiment of all that is capitalist and free trade and free market in the world. And that, we're in a situation where we're being held hostage by pharmaceutical industry, because we have a desperate population that wants drugs.
As I understand it, Burroughs Wellcome saw very early on that they could make a move into a new market. You can hardly blame them. That's what capitalism is. It's an ever-expanding market, isn't it? And of course, in this country, along with Professor Robin Weiss, they developed one of the first antibody tests, which gave them an open door to sell the drugs to the people who tested positive on their test.
Burroughs Wellcome and all of the other drug companies are making millions and millions of dollars off these drugs. The new protease inhibitors that are out there right now, they require you, in most cases, to take other antiviral drugs with the protease inhibitors. In other words, you just don't take the protease inhibitors, you take the AZT and the DDI or the DDC. Combination of all these drugs. The drug companies are making a fortune.
There's a lengthy story that one could go into in greater detail there about how the charitable arm of Wellcome actually sold off their shares just in time to avoid the Wellcome share price crash that followed the results of the Concord trial, the first results of the Concord trial being released. People, shrewd money, realized that AZT was not... but you know, what about shrewd patients? I mean, an awful lot of patients are still swallowing it. I think people are denied the information in order to become shrewd patients. If there were more shrewd patients and less shrewd investors, we'd be better off.
A lot of people are dying now because of hepatic failure and because of renal failure, because the toxicities that develop in the liver due to the protease inhibitors and the nucleotide analogs being used in the combinations that are being used now are toxic.
There was one paper at the recent retrovirus conference that showed that 29% of people taking protease inhibitors in rural Idaho who had never taken anything were resistant to it. So, you know, I think that there are people who seem to feel they're benefiting from this, but this is like every other drug that's come out on the market. It's not the savior. Not only is it exorbitantly priced, but my fear, and this is what some of the papers are showing, is that pretty soon people who are taking these combos are going to be resistant to everything.
What they look for is surrogate markers now. Have you heard that term battered about? Surrogate markers means, well, it doesn't seem to do anything for the disease, but it does every now and then do something for the level of CD4 cells that we measure, or it does something for this or that. Not that anybody really knows whether you want more or less CD4 cells at any particular time in your life. A lot of diseases cause CD4 to go up. A lot of diseases cause it to go down. Nobody's even sure if a CD4 cell is always a CD4 cell. Just it's a marker on the cell at the time that they do this little counting procedure, which is to stick a fluorescent tag on there and say the ones that light up have CD4 on the outside. And we don't really know what those cells do. The immune system is incredibly complicated. And the immunologists' brains are not nearly complicated enough to deal with it. We have these little, you know, there are theories all over the place, but no real competent immunologist would tell you that CD4 levels was a surrogate marker for anything until we know more about it. But that's what they're using. That's what the FDA is saying, yeah. You don't have to show that it helps them. These protease inhibitors, the same thing. You don't have to show that it helps the patient. You don't have to show a single life saved. All you have to do is show some little clinical indicator has changed in a way that somebody is hoping is going to make you better.
I've met hundreds of patients. I've interviewed them. T cells, 1, 0, 30, 80, perfectly healthy people, and they just go on like that. T cells, I don't think they have any idea what T cells are.
The margin of error in counting T cells is incredible. And there's also a huge margin of error in viral loads. What day of the week you take it, what, you know, how stressed out you are. It's not just, you know, what medication you're on.
Thank you very much for watching. Hope this is giving you some thoughts to reconstruct our ideas about what is and is not right on the subject of AIDS, so we don't panic and so we're not manipulated by a very compliant media that only presents one side of the issue. I'm Gary Null, and I'll be back next week exploring more on AIDS: A Second Opinion.